Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we currently have 2 applications out for the King's Indian on iPhone and on Android. Check them out. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we're going to take a look at a game played between the former world champion Garry Kasparov in a simul against a player rated 1985, Jukemura. In this game, we'll get a chance to see how Kasparov easily gains a dominating position and exploits some very minor inaccuracies in the opening. By doing so, I hope that we'll expand our understanding of how to handle a space advantage and get some feeling for how to handle some tricky options in the opening. The game begins with the move pawn to d4, Kasparov handling the white pieces, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, the Queen's Gambit, and now the unusual reply to the Queen's Gambit, bishop to f5, known as the Baltic defense. With bishop to f5, Black does not seem to be addressing the threat of c takes d5 followed by knight to c3, but in fact, after the move pawn takes pawn on d5, Black inserts the move bishop takes b1 as a way of eliminating this knight, which would come out to the c3 square. Now, why might Black be interested in giving up the bishop pair so early? One of the reasons is that first of all, he's eliminated this key knight on c3, as we pointed out, and this could mean that White will have more difficulty controlling the critical e4 square as the game wears along. But another reason why Black might want to do this is that later on, if he brings his pawn out to the e6 square, as he often does in the Queen's Gambit, he won't be blocking in his bishop on c8. And as a result, he won't have to worry about being left behind with a bad bishop, and at the same time, his rooks may also find that they're easier to get coordinated along the back rank. Now, importantly, as we'll discuss in a video on the Baltic defense, the move rook takes b1 is not the most common move here. Instead, White first throws in the move queen to a4 check, then only after the move pawn to c6, and d takes c6 is an option here, but White now normally plays rook takes b1, and now queen takes d5 is played. And this insertion of the moves queen to a4 check and pawn to c6 benefits White in 2 ways. First of all, the queen defends the pawn on a2, and secondly, the knight is now deprived of its most logical location, which would be the c6 square. A theme which is always true in chess and which is just as true in the opening as in the middle game or endgame phases is that it's always very important to be alert to unusual and tactical possibilities. One of the things which I'm stressing over and over again with students currently at this point in our development is that we can't just look at positions and just go for the first move which comes to mind, such as rook takes b1. Instead, we have to learn how to be sensitive to little nuances like this move, queen to a4 check, which is key in this position, as it creates just these tiny factors which allow White the difference between keeping an advantage or going into equality. So queen to a4 check is played, pawn to c6 was played, rook takes b1 was played, queen takes d5, and now White played the move knight to f3, simply getting on with development. Now, if we take a look at this position, Black's best bet for being able to prove equality involves being able to strike with the move pawn to e5. Now, why is this? White has 2 subtle advantages in this position. White has access to the bishop pair. He has collected the light-squared bishop in exchange for a knight. And secondly, he has 2 central pawns versus 1 central pawn on the e7 square. Ideally, White would like to be able to bring his other pawn up to the e4 square at a good moment and then build upon this space advantage to find better pieces, better locations for his pieces, and then eventually push black backwards. And this is exactly what happened in the game. Black should be principally occupied with preventing this plan with his own active counterplay, and the best way to do this is to look for a way to strike out with the move pawn to e5 as quickly as possible. Now, black continued with the move knight to d7, and this is the most common move, adding a defender and attacker to the e5 square, and perhaps preparing this plan of e5, as well as simply getting on with development. After the move knight to d7, white now played the move pawn to a3, and this can come in handy for a couple of different reasons. White may find it very useful at a later phase of the game to advance the b pawn up to the b4 square. At the same time, the pawn also defends the b4 square against a potential infiltration by the bishop on b4. Perhaps most importantly, by bringing the pawn to the a3 square, white is freeing the queen from the defense of the a2 pawn so that the queen can retreat to c2, thereby helping to protect the e4 square and helping white to achieve the move e2 to e4. So a2 to a3 was played. Now, most commonly, black plays the move knight g to f6 here. And now there are a couple different ways for white to play. If he simply retreats with the move queen to c2, the move pawn to e5 is possible, and now white can still probably get an advantage after pawn to e3, pawn takes pawn on d4, and bishop to c4, with a somewhat dynamic position going on here, but white will retain some space advantage in the center. He can handle the move queen a5 with either bishop to d2, with probably the move bishop to d2, and now he doesn't have to worry about bishop to b4 because of the pawn on a3. And again, white has the bishop pair and will have some space advantage in the center. Now, another way which white might continue rather than queen to c2 after this move knight g to f6 is to continue with the move pawn to e3 rather than retreating the queen. And here the move pawn to e5 would be an outright blunder, since white immediately wins material with bishop to c4. And now, if black were to play queen to e4, white would have the tactical reply, bishop takes f7 check, and the bishop cannot be captured because of the move knight to g5 check, picking up the queen on e4. Therefore, after the move bishop to c4, black needs to reply queen to d6, and now white can set up a double threat with the move queen to b3, attacking both the b7 pawn and the pawn on f7, and therefore the move pawn to e5 is out of the question after pawn to e3, but instead black can play queen to e4, and after knight to d2, again we have a position which is a little bit better for white. Now, in the game, black did not play this most common move knight g to f6, and as a result he never achieved the move pawn to e5 either. Instead, he played the move knight to b6, and this ended up causing quite a few problems as the game wore along. White continued simply with queen to c2, a move which was already in the cards. Knight to f6 was played, pawn to e3, pawn to g6, attempting to develop the bishop, bishop to d3, bishop to g7, castles kingside, castles kingside. White now continued with pawn to e4. Again, white has now achieved the significant pawn duo, pawns on e4, pawns on d4. Black played the move queen to d7, and now white simply continued with bishop to e3. And at this point, white already has a powerful advantage in this position. White has maintained and improved upon both of the advantages we've talked about so far. White still has the bishop pair, and he has both of his pawns situated on the 4th rank. How does he go about converting this? There are some principles to keep in mind whenever we're working with a space advantage. The more material that Kasparov can keep on the board, the more that his space advantage will be worth. Always keep in mind that our eventual goal in chess is to translate whatever advantage we have, whether it's an advantage in space or an advantage in development. Eventually we have to translate this into concrete threats and then weaknesses and then material and or an attack on the king. Again, let me say that one more time. We somehow have to eventually checkmate the king, and this is most often done by a direct attack on the king or by gaining material and eventually converting that material into a victory and an attack on the king. But before we can get to the material advantage, we first have to create some weaknesses. And before we can create some weaknesses, we first have to create some threats to the position which the opponent is incapable of handling. And before we can develop those threats, we first have to have some sort of advantage in piece coordination so that the opponent cannot handle things as easily as we can. And in this case, White is working with a space advantage in the center, and he's working with the 2 bishops, and he's going to eventually convert these factors into concrete threats and weaknesses in the opponent's position, whereas Black has much less maneuvering space and is incapable of developing any threats in the position. Continuing on, knight h5 is played. The rook is on d1. And now Black played queen to c7, preparing to bring this knight to f4. It's very interesting. If you take some time to really study Black's position here, you'll see that it's not so easy to come up with any sort of useful options. And again, this is the benefit of this pawn front which Black has. Perhaps bringing a rook to the d file would be the move which would be most obvious to me here, but again, it would not really be generating any threat because Black is never going to be able to capture on d4 and risk losing the queen as a result. And so it would just be, for show, bringing the rook to the d file. And in fact, it's just really difficult to find an active plan for Black here. So queen to c7 is an attempt to move the knight to f4. White now began to expand on the queen side with pawn to b4. Knight to f4 was played. Bishop to f1 was played. Rook a to c8 was played. Pawn to a4. Knight to e6. Queen to b3. Again, not a lot going on here for Black. Queen to d7. Now, pawn to a5, forcing this knight backwards. Knight to a8 was played. And now, pawn to b5, setting up a very interesting moment, but this position is actually completely lost for Black. If he takes the pawn on b5, c takes b5, again, just as Kasparov has gone out of his way to avoid some of the exchanges like knight f4 was offering an exchange, here, rather than trading queens, White would simply continue with bishop takes b5, and eventually by playing moves like queen to a3, pawn to d5, targeting the b7 pawn, the a7 pawn, or the e7 pawn, maybe even bringing this bishop to c5 with adequate support, eventually something will crumble in Black's position. And instead of capturing here, Black continued with knight a to c7. The move pawn to d5 was played, and Kasparov quickly won a pawn after pawn takes pawn on d5, pawn takes pawn on d5, knight to d8, bishop takes b7, and now some quick and excellent technique on Kasparov's part. Rook to a8, pawn to b6, knight to e8, bishop to b5, queen to d6, pawn to a6, simply creating the threat of a takes b7 followed by bishop to c6. Black played the move pawn to e6, and now there are actually a variety of ways to win, but Kasparov finished off with a takes b7, knight takes b7, bishop to c6, attacking this knight on b7. Queen to e7 was played, and Black resigned after d takes e6, as after the recapture f takes e6, the simple move rook to d7 will be more than enough to pick up material and win the game. Interestingly, also notice that Black's dark squared bishop on g7 played absolutely no role throughout the contest. This game was relatively straightforward. Kasparov was aware of the opening subtlety, which we discussed at the beginning, and then he simply gathered up a space advantage, was able to make use of it quite easily by advancing the pawns up the board, creating the weaknesses, and by doing so, Kasparov managed to create for us a model game both against the Baltic defense and also about how to take advantage of the space advantage. That's all for today, and we'll see you again soon. Before you go, if you have an opportunity, be sure to check out that we have 3 applications available on the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Check them out.